please be advised that there is material that will be presented that is not AA conference approved material. We believe that Joe and Charlie clearly state when they present material that is not AA conference approved material. The presentation has been color-coded to better assist you as to the origin of the information.
My name is Joe and I'm an alcoholic. And it's truly by God's grace and the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that I found in a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm sober this morning, and for that I'm very, very thankful. And I've been sober ever since November 3rd, 1973, and for that I am truly thankful. And there are a number of other people who are very thankful for that too.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Charlie Parman. I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic.
Hi, Charlie.
Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of the power that I found through the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink for 12,288 days today, one day at a time, and for this I'm very grateful. Great to be here. Joe and I are going to have a lot of fun. I hope you guys do too. And I always like to start the Big Book study with telling a little joke on we alcoholics. Yeah, I think it's so appropriate for people like us. And down in the States, there was a brain surgeon that developed a way to transplant the human brain in its entirety. You know, they've been doing that for years with other organs of the body. He figured out a way to do it with the human brain. And this old man goes to him and he said, "Doc, I've got problems with my brain. I can't remember anything and can't figure things out and I can't think very good and I get lost all the time. Do you think you might be able to help me?" And the surgeon said, "Well, let's give you a good physical exam and see what kind of shape your body's in first." So he gave him a good physical exam and he said, "Oh yeah, your body's in great shape." He said, "I believe I could transplant a brain into your head and everything would be just fine." And the old man said, "Well, great, what do you have to offer?" And the surgeon said, "Well, let's go up in the display room and I'll show you what we've got in stock at the present time." And they go up in this room and the surgeon said, "Now over here, in this case, I've got the brains of an attorney." And he said, "I could transplant this in your head and everything would be fine and it'll cost you $20,000. And the old man said, "Well, do you have anything else?" And he said, "Oh yeah, this case over here, I've got the brains of a doctor." He said, "I could transplant this in your head, everything would be fine, it'll cost you $50,000. And the old man said, "Well, do you have anything else?" And he said, "Oh yeah. In this case over here, I have the brains of an alcoholic." And he said, "I could transplant this in your head and everything would be okay and it'll cost you $100,000. And the old man said, "I don't understand this deal. $20,000 for the attorney's brain, $50,000 for the doctor's brain, and $100,000 for the alcoholic brain?" The doctor said, "Well, hell yes, man, it's brand new. It's never been used before." I think most of us will go to the grave with at least 50,000 miles left on the original warranty that we never did touch. See? If we're going to talk about the Big Book, of course, which is what we're going to do this weekend, we like to go back and look at just a little bit of the history behind the book. We're not going to go into it too deep, but a little bit of the history behind the book and a little information about the people who wrote the book in the first place. And if we can see some of that history, I think it'll make it a lot easier to understand the book as we go through it throughout the entire weekend. So if you guys are ready, we're ready also. Let's go to the foreword to the second edition. It's on Roman numeral 15. And let's go to the last page on that, or last paragraph on that page, Roman numeral 15. Joe?
Now, there's one thing that Bill Wilson did that you can remember this in reading Bill Wilson's writings. Anything that he wrote, he always follows a certain pattern. For instance, he'll always tell us what the problem is. He'll give us a solution to that problem. Then he'll give us a program of action to implement the solution that he just described. He does that over and over and over in all of his writings. And certainly he does that here in the Big Book. And on Roman numeral page 15 it says, The spark that was to flare in the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician.
Now, we know that New York stockbroker to be this fellow named Bill Wilson. I think we're treating Bill pretty good when we call him a New York stockbroker. He really wasn't. He was a New York City stock speculator. He made his living out of selling fast-talking to slow-thinking people. We don't want to take anything away from Bill. He's a great man. But we all need to realize that he's a real alcoholic, and he thought and he acted just like the rest of we alcoholics did. And, of course, the Akron physician is this fellow named Dr. Bob Smith, who lived in Akron, Ohio at that time, Joe.
So 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who'd been in contact with the alcohol groups of that day.
A little later on, as we get into the book, into Bill's story, we're going to see where Bill was visited by an old friend, another alcoholic named Ebby Thatcher. And Ebby Thatcher was an old school friend of Bill's, and they drank together a lot when they were growing up. And Ebby came to see Bill in Bill's kitchen in New York City, and he sat down with Bill, and he gave Bill what turned out later to be 2 very valuable pieces of information. He said, Bill, people like you and I that have become absolutely powerless over alcohol, if we are to recover from that condition, we're going to have the aid of a power greater than human power. He said, we've tried the doctors, we've tried the ministers, we've tried all human sources, and none of them have worked for us. And if we're to recover, it's going to have to be based upon the aid of a power greater than human power. And he said, I've been attending meetings with a group of people called the Oxford Groupers, and they told me that if I could have a vital spiritual experience, that during that vital spiritual experience I would find the power greater than human power, and then through that power I would be able to overcome my alcoholism. And he said, they also, Bill, have promised to me, they gave me a little program of action, and that they promised to me that if I would apply that program of action in my life, that I would have that spiritual experience, that I would find that power greater than human power, and I would be able to recover from alcoholism. And he said, look at me, Bill. It's been 2 months since I've had a drink. And this made a great impression on Bill. He knew Ebby Thatcher, and he knew how Ebby drank. And he knew that if Ebby was staying sober, some power greater than Ebby had to be working in Ebby's life. And as it turned out, Ebby gave him 2 pieces of the information necessary to recover. He gave him first the idea of the need for the vital spiritual experience, finding of the power greater than human power, which turns out to be the solution to alcoholism. He also gave him the practical program of action, that if he would apply it in his life, he would find that power. So 2 things that Bill had to know came from Ebby: the solution, the vital spiritual experience, and the program of action necessary to have that spiritual experience.
He'd also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William B. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism, who is now counted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. From this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism.
In the summer of 1933, Bill was placed in a town's hospital in New York City to be withdrawn from alcohol by a little doctor called Dr. Silkworth. And when Bill's mind cleared enough that he could hear and understand things, Dr. Silkworth sat down with Bill and explained to him his ideas about this thing called alcoholism. He said, Bill, I do not believe people like you suffer from alcoholism because they lack willpower. He said, I don't think willpower's got anything to do with it. He said, I don't believe moral character has anything to do with alcoholism. And he said, I don't believe sin has anything to do with it either. He said, I really believe that people like you are suffering from an illness And he said it's a very peculiar illness. It seems to be a twofold illness. An illness of the body as well as an illness of the mind. And he said, I believe that when people like you put any alcohol whatsoever into their body, that it produces an actual physical craving that makes it virtually impossible for you to stop drinking after you have once started. He said this doesn't happen to normal people. It only happens to about 1 person out of 10 who drinks alcohol. And he said because of that physical craving that's developed in the body after you take a drink, you'll never be able to safely drink again, because that craving will be so strong each time you take that drink that you'll be unable to stop until you end up drunk and sick and in all kinds of trouble. And he said you can no longer safely drink because of the body. And he said, I also believe that people like you have developed what we call an obsession of the mind. And he said an obsession of the mind is an idea that overcomes all ideas to the contrary. He said an obsession of the mind is an idea that is so strong that it can make you believe something that's not true. And he said the truth is you can't safely drink alcohol. And he said from time to time you realize that truth. And you swear off and you quit drinking. And you say, I'll never take another drink as long as I live. But he said then after a day or 2 or 3 or 4 or a week, your mind begins to think about taking a drink. And the next thing you know, your mind convinces you that it's going to be different this time. He said it may start as simply as, I'm just going to have 1 drink tonight and that's all. Or I'm just going to have 1 beer tonight and that's all. But he said your mind will tell you you can have that 1 drink and everything will be okay. And he said then you'll take the drink and you'll trigger the craving and you'll end up drunk all over again. He said you can no longer safely drink because of the body, nor can you keep from drinking because of the mind. And he said if you can't drink without getting drunk, and if you can't keep from drinking, then you've become absolutely powerless over alcohol. And the first time in his life, Bill understood his problem. He always thought it was a matter of willpower. He thought it was moral character. He thought it was sin. Why would he not? That's what everybody had told him up until that time. But when Dr. Silkworth explained the illness to him, the physical craving that develops in the body, the obsession of the mind that makes us believe something that isn't true, for the first time, Bill understood his problem. And he said to himself, now that I know what's wrong with me, I'll not have to drink anymore. So knowing the problem, he thought would be sufficient. Shortly thereafter, his mind told him it's okay to take a drink. And Bill took a drink and he got drunk and he drank for another year. And he was put back in the town's hospital for the 2nd time. This time, Dr. Silkworth pronounced him incurable. Told Bill's wife that he's going to have to be locked up, or she's going to have to hire a bodyguard to go with him. And said if you don't, he's going to die during DTs, or he'll become a wet brain in a short period of time. And Bill overheard that. Fear sobered him up for a bit in the summer of 1934. But in November 1934, his mind told him it's okay to take a drink. And he took a drink and he triggered a craving and he couldn't stop. So knowing the problem was not sufficient to solve it. It's necessary that he knew it, but it did not solve it. It's only when Ebbie came to see him and brought him the solution and the program of action that Bill was able to recover from alcoholism. He had to know what is the problem, what is the solution, and what is the program of action.
The book goes on to say, and Ebbie began to take Bill to these Oxford group meetings and introduced him to the tenets of the Oxford group. And our book says, though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of the need of moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of, belief in, and dependence upon God, which were the tenets of the Oxford group, which were later on with some other steps added to make the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he succeeded only in keeping sober himself. Bill liked the idea of trying to help other people to stay sober, and Bill went about his business working that part of the tenets of the Oxford group, trying to help people stay sober. He'd go out in the gutters of the streets of New York and drag people out of the streets and take them to the Oxford group meetings. He'd go into some of the bars and take them off the bar stool and take them to these meetings. Most of them didn't want to go, but Bill was taking them anyhow because it was helping him stay sober, and he liked that idea of trying to help other people stay sober. But the broker had gone to Akron on a business venture in which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. He said he realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician, and we know the story of that. Bill went out to Akron to engage in a proxy fight to help take over a very lucrative company called the Akron Machine and Tool Company, and had his proxy fight been successful, Bill would have been set on his feet financially. He could have got his wife out of that department store who she was working, supporting him in his efforts to stay sober and to help other people stay sober. But his venture collapsed, and he's walking up and down in the lobby of that hotel, and he's trying to think about what his future is going to be. He didn't have enough money to pay his hotel bill, but he had a little bit of money in his pocket, and he thought he might go in the bar there and get an acquaintance. He was pretty sad and depressed and upset because he lost his proxy fight. He said, I'll go in that bar there and I'll strike up an acquaintance, maybe, and get rid of some of this loneliness that I have. And then he said, oh, no, I better not do that. If I go in there, I'm going to get drunk. He always did. And I think a lot about Bill in that moment. And had it been up to me to either go in that bar and have 2 or 3 drinks or do what he did, we may not be here if it had been left up to me. But Bill turned to the left and walked down there to the telephone, and he said, every time I tried to help drunks in New York, I felt better and I stayed sober. So he begins to call people on the telephone, trying to find a drunk to stay sober. He finally got a hold of the Reverend Walter Tunks. And he said, Reverend Tunks, he called himself a rumham from New York, and I have a solution for alcoholism, and I need a drunk to work with. Do you know any? And Walter Tunks said, no, I don't. But I know a lady who knows one, and her name was Henrietta Seiberling. They were both members of the Oxford group. Of course, Bill didn't know that at the time. So they got a hold of Henrietta and said, Henrietta, you know that Dr. Bob, and we've been praying that he might find a way to get sober. Well, I think this is a solution to our prayers. And would you set up a meeting between Dr. Bob and Bill? And she said, yes, I would. So he was to go over there that afternoon, and he said, she called Ann Smith and said, Ann, can we get Dr. Bob over here? We have this fellow from New York who seemed to have a solution for alcoholism. And she said, no, I'm afraid we can't get him over there this afternoon. You know, it's Mother's Day, and he brought me a potted plant, and he's underneath the table potted himself. He's unable to get there. But we'll be over tomorrow at 5 o'clock. And fine. So the next morning she said, Dr. Bob, we're going to go over to Henrietta's place. We've got this fellow named Bill from New York who seems to have a solution for alcoholism. Dr. Bob had a hangover. He didn't feel good at all. And he said, well, I'm not going over there. She said, oh, yes, you are. And he said, oh, no, I'm not. You know how that goes. And she said, oh, yes, you are. Well, she won out. And he said, okay, all right, I'll go over there and I'll stay 15 minutes. That's all. No more. And he went over there with the intention of staying 15 minutes, and he and Bill went off into another room to visit. And Bill sat down with Dr. Bob and told him about the illness of alcoholism. He told him what he had learned in New York. Prior to coming to Akron, he'd always tried to cram this great spiritual experience down the throat of these other alcoholics he was working with. And Dr. Silkworth said, why don't you talk to them about the illness of alcoholism? Explain to them about the physical allergy and the obsession of the mind, how that worked with you. And if they will buy that, then you can talk to them about spiritual matters. Bill didn't know at the moment, that Dr. Bob had been going to the Oxford groups for many, many years, trying to find a solution to his drinking problem. And they prayed about it 2 or 3 weeks prior to Bill showing up on the scene. And here was the answer to their prayers. Later on in Dr. Bob's writings, he said that he sat down with Bill, and here was the first man that he'd ever met that really knew about alcoholism. And he was to stay there with Bill for more than 5.5 hours. Had committed to 15 minutes, but stayed 5.5 hours. One of the first miracles in Alcoholics Anonymous. One person could sit down with an untrained person, sit down and talk to a doctor about the illness of alcoholism. And doctors understand illnesses, you know. It's hard to tell a doctor anything. That was a miracle of the meeting, that the doctor would listen to Bill talk about the illness of alcoholism.
The next paragraph says this physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. Bill did something with Dr. Bob that he had never done before. Back in New York City, he always tried to insist and force the spiritual experience on the people he had tried to work with. None had responded. Just prior to going to Akron, he talked to Dr. Silkworth. Dr. Silkworth says, "Why don't you tell them what I told you?" He said, "Explain to them the exact nature of the illness." He said, "Every alcoholic I know has 2 questions. Number 1, why can't I drink without getting drunk like I used to? And number 2, why can't I stay sober now that I want to?" And he said, if you will answer those questions, you'll get their attention. Then you can talk about spirituality. So Bill sat down with Dr. Bob, and he didn't talk about spirituality. He talked about what Dr. Silkworth had told him, and he related how it had occurred in his life. He told about the many, many times he stopped in the speakeasy just to have a couple of drinks, then going to go home and have dinner. And he said something would happen and I'd be unable to stop drinking. And I might not get home that night or the next day or the next week. And Dr. Bob said, "My God, man, that's what's been happening to me." And Bill explained to him about this physical craving of the body that develops after we've had a drink or two. He said, "Man, I've got a tremendous amount of willpower. Always been able to do anything I wanted to do." But he said it seemed as though when it comes to alcohol, willpower is non-existent. He said, "I'll swear off drinking one day, and I'll find myself that afternoon sitting in the bar wondering how in the hell did I get here this time?" Dr. Bob said, "My God, man, that's what's been happening to me." And Bill explained to him what Dr. Silkworth said about the obsession of the mind. And for the first time, Dr. Bob saw the problem. And after he saw the problem, the hopeless condition of the body and the mind, then he was able to apply the Oxford Group program to a debt that he never had before. And he recovered from alcoholism too. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another, as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated a strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. Hence the 2 men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward at the Akron City Hospital. The very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. Dr. Bob said, "Bill, we need to find somebody to work with, or we'll get drunk ourselves." Bill said, "Well, do you know any drunks here in Akron?" Dr. Bob said, "I don't know." But he said, "I know a nurse. I don't know one down at the hospital." He called the nurse and told this nurse that he had a guy there from New York City. And they felt they had a means that they could help alcoholics recover. And said, "Do you have anybody in there at the present time?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, we do." He said, "We got a corker up here." Said he just blacked both eyes of one of the nurses. Said, "We've got him tied down in here." And said, "By the way, Dr. Bob, have you tried this on yourself yet?" Dr. Bob didn't think anybody knew about his drinking, but they all knew, of course. And he said, put him in a private room and we'll be down to see him. They go down to see this guy, and he's named Bill Dodson. And you see his picture in AA rooms all over the world, called The Man on the Bed. And they sit down with Bill Dodson, and they didn't talk to Bill Dodson about Bill Dodson's drinking. Everybody else had already done that. They didn't do that. They talked to Bill Dodson about their drinking. They explained about this physical allergy of the body that took over whenever they took a drink, and they ended up drunk every time. They explained the obsession of the mind, and Bill Dodson said, yeah, that's what's wrong with me. He said, that's exactly what's wrong with me. He said, I thought it was willpower. I thought it was moral character. I thought it was sin. Why would he not? That's what everybody had told him up until that time. But when these two drunks sat there and shared their own story with him, he identified with them immediately. Then they began to talk to him about the solution being spiritual. Then they began to talk to him about a program of action. They come back the next day, and Dodson's wife is there in the room. And he said, yeah, there they are. I said, there's those two guys that I was telling you about. There's the guys that were up here yesterday and told me what's wrong with me. He said, get my clothes out of the closet. I'm going home. And he got up and he dressed and he went home. And he applied the program of action. And he recovered from alcoholism. Never to drink again up to the moment of his death. So that makes three of them now in Akron in the summer of 1935. They all three know three things. What is the problem? What is the solution? And what is the program of action? They all three had applied the program of action and recovered from alcoholism.
So this work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. There had been many failures, but was occasionally heartening success. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time. No AA yet.
When these guys were working there in the summer of 1935, they really didn't know what they were doing. Everything they did was on a trial and error method. And they would try something, and if it worked, they would retain it, and if it didn't work, they would discard it. One of Dr. Bob's favorite things was to fill them up with sauerkraut juice mixed with honey. The sauerkraut juice had the vitamins the body needed, and the honey made it possible to drink the damn stuff, And they tried this, and they tried that, and I tried other things, and every once in a while one of these guys would fall over dead. And I can just see Bill turn to Bob and say, oh, shit, let's don't do that again, So as we look back at that time, we give credit to Bill, Bob, the first 100, which we rightfully should. But I think we ought to give some credit to those that they failed with, too. They probably learned more by the failures than they did by the successes. Finally, Bill had to go back to New York City. He said, I've got to go back home, got to get a job going, got to make a little money. My wife's working back there in a department store for $10 or $15 a week. And when he left behind him what later became the first group of AA. No AA in those days. They were members of the Oxford group. And the Oxford groupers didn't care too much for the alcoholics. That wasn't their real thing. Their real thing was to straighten out the more elite members of society, whatever their problems might be, and then maybe straighten out the mayor of the town and the governor of the state and president of the country and etc. They didn't care too much about the drunks. Drunks wasn't too crazy about the Oxford groupers either. The drunks liked to go to those Oxford group meetings and smoke cigarettes and drop ashes on the floor and spill coffee and tell dirty jokes. Oxford groupers didn't like that. The Oxford groupers had a thing they called the four absolutes, where you're supposed to practice absolute love, absolute purity, absolute honesty, and absolute unselfishness. The drunks were having a hell of a time being an absolute anything except drunks, and they didn't like that. So they called themselves the drunk squad of the Oxford group. That's what Bill left behind him in the summer of 1935, the drunk squad of the Oxford group.
By late 1937, the number of members, as on Roman numeral page 27, by late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic.
Bill went back to New York City in the fall of 1935, and there he began to apply what he had learned to do with Dr. Bob in Akron. He began to talk to drunks about the problem, the hopeless condition of the mind and of the body, the physical craving in the body and the obsession of the mind. And next thing you know, some of those guys started getting sober in New York City. There was one or two up in Akron, or up in Cleveland, had heard about this thing down in Akron. They came down and talked to Dr. Bob. One or two of those got sober. So they began to start little bitty groups of these drunk squad of the Oxford groups in these various different cities back in the eastern part of the country. 1937, Bill went back to Akron to visit with Dr. Bob, again on a business venture. And they sat down in Dr. Bob's kitchen and they counted the number of people that they knew that were staying sober based on these three pieces of information. And to their amazement, they found about 40 people were staying sober. And I think for the first time they began to realize we just might have the answer to this thing called alcoholism. Then the question immediately became, if we found the answer, then what are we going to do with it? Are we going to keep it here in Akron and franchise it? Are we going to sell it? Are we going to give it away? If we're going to give it away, what's the best way to do that? And Bill and Bob couldn't make the decision. And this might have started the idea of the group conscience in AA. They said, let's call a meeting here of these guys in Akron, and let's sit down and talk about this and see what we really want to do with this information. And they called a meeting. There was 18 people present at that meeting. Not all alcoholics. Some were regular Oxford group meetings. And they discussed what they were going to do with this information and how best to get it to the greatest number of people.
They met in the home of a family called T. Henry Williams, and his wife's name was Clarice, who were members of the Oxford group who were non-alcoholics, and this meeting took place in their home. It was now time the struggling groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. That night at the meeting, they decided to do three things, basically. One, they decided that alcoholics were having a hard time getting into hospital, so they decided they would build some hospitals. All the way across USA and all the way across Canada, they would build hospitals.
Right in the middle of the Depression, nobody's got a dime, but we're going to build those hospitals anyhow.
You can already see the alcoholic mind at work here. So you're going to use a lot of money, other people's money, but that's what they were going to do. And I suppose that Dr. Bob would probably be the head doctor in charge of all that. Sure. Another thing they decided to do, that if they're going to have all these hospitals, they're certainly going to need customers, and they were going to have to send people out and try to find customers for these hospitals. And so they called themselves a missionary. Going to go out and perform a missionary project, finding drunks to take to these hospitals. And Bill, I suppose, would be the head missionary. And so that would keep the hospitals full. Another thought came to him was, well, you know, they already seen they were having a little problem, that people were beginning to embellish this little program that they had developed through word of mouth and presenting to one another here and there. People were already beginning to change that a little. You know, alcoholics will embellish the truth just a little bit and give them a chance. So they decided they better write that down on a book and tell everybody who would read that book precisely how they were staying sober and to preserve the message. Besides that, they could write this book and make some profits, fund the hospitals and fund the missionaries, and everything would be wonderful. You can see the mind of the alcoholic, you see. Thank God they only accomplished one thing. They did write a book. He said, this determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. Well, after they wrote the book, they decided they better name the book, you know, get a title for the book. Somebody said, well, let's call it The Way Out. Sounded like a pretty good name for a book. Did some research on that and found that there was 12 or 13 other titles called The Way Out, so they discarded that. Somebody said, well, let's call it Comes the Dawn. Now, that sounds like a pretty good name for a book, doesn't it? Comes the Dawn. And they discussed that and kicked that out. Bill said, I tell you what, let's call it 100 men. Doesn't that sound good? 100 men. And then a woman joined the group. Well, they couldn't call it 100 men and a woman, so they kicked that out. And Bill was getting a little disgusted by now. He said, let's just call it the Bill W. movement. 5 seconds later, they voted that down. And there was a nut from a nut house that's sitting over there in the corner, and he was kind of drooling out of both sides of his mouth, mupping up and down. And he began to mumble off a few words. He began to say, "Anonymous Alcoholics, Alcoholics Anonymous." And somehow those two words stuck with that group. And they called their book Alcoholics Anonymous. And I think it's apropos that a nut from a nut house named the book called Alcoholics Anonymous.
Now, what's really important is to always remember the first Alcoholics Anonymous the world ever saw was a book titled Alcoholics Anonymous. This is the first printing of the first edition of the big book Alcoholics Anonymous, printed in 1939. You'll notice how large it is. You'll notice how thick it is. Now, these guys were real alcoholics. If you open the book and look at it, you'll notice that the printing on the page is exactly the same size as it is on the page in your book today. But look how wide the margins are. Wide margins makes a big book. They went to a printer and they said, "We want the cheapest old paper that you've got." Cheap paper is thick. And the thicker the paper, the thicker the book. Makes it an extremely large book. They called it the Big Book Alcohol, the Big Book, period. That's where it got its name. And I always laugh when I look at the dust jacket. You'll notice the bright colors on it. The yellows and all the bright... Can't you just see some guy in New York City walking down the street with this under his arm, trying to remain anonymous? You know? They said, "Hell, let's put these bright colors on there. That'll catch everybody's eye." And they'll look at this book and they'll buy this book, the Big Book Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, in the Big Book Alcoholics Anonymous, this contains the story of how the first 100 men and women recovered from alcoholism. It tells it just exactly like they told it when they went out to visit a new alcoholic. It talks first about the problem. Then it talks about the solution. Then it talks about the program of action. They said, "We'll never be able to go visit all the alcoholics in the United States and Canada on a one-on-one basis. So the book's going to have to do what we've been doing on a personal one-on-one basis." And this book then began to go out across the country. Now, it also says the fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. So in 1939, we had two Alcoholics Anonymouses. We had a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. We had a fellowship called Alcoholics Anonymous. And the program in the book was exactly the same as the program in the fellowship, because the people in the fellowship had written their program into the book. And there was no quarrel between the two. The book program and the fellowship program were exactly the same. The book then began to go out across the country. And the first person up here in Canada got a hold of it, read it, studied it, did what it said, recovered from alcoholism, started an AA group. First one in California did the same thing. The first one in Texas. The first one in Louisiana. The first one in Oklahoma. First one in Illinois. That's the way it started. Then the fellowship began to grow from the book Alcoholics Anonymous. But as the fellowship got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, they began to notice something that the first 100 didn't have. They begin to notice the great strength and power that comes from large numbers of people gathering together who have solved a common problem. And they begin to realize how much power was within just the fellowship itself. And when they begin to realize that maybe they could stay sober without doing all the things the book said to do, They begin to question the need to do everything that's in the book. And the program and the fellowship begin to change. They begin to say, you mean we got to turn our entire will and life over to the care of God as we understand Him? Couldn't we just give Him the alcohol and we'll keep the rest? You mean we've got to share everything with another human being? God already knows about it. We already know about it. Why tell it to somebody else? You mean we got to get rid of all of our character defects? Hell, how are we going to make a living if we do that? You mean we got to make amends to all those people we've harmed? And they begin to say, well, maybe we don't have to do all of it. Maybe we can take some and maybe we can leave some. And the program and the fellowship kept changing more and more and more and more and more. Along came the advent of the treatment centers. Now, please don't get us wrong. We've got nothing against treatment centers. They serve a worthwhile purpose in some cases. But in the treatment center, in order to justify their being there, they're going to have to be doing things other than what's in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. And people begin to learn new terminology in the treatment centers. And they begin to talk about things other than just alcoholism. And then they would come into AA, and naturally they would bring the terminology they had learned out there into AA. And in AA meetings, we begin to hear about chemical dependency. We begin to hear about dual dependency. We begin to hear about polyaddiction. We begin to hear about dysfunctional families. We begin to hear about dysfunctional sex lives. We begin to hear about significant others. And after a while, the program that was being talked about in the meetings no longer resembled the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous at all. Today, sometimes you go to an AA meeting, and if they didn't read the preamble before the meeting, you wouldn't know what kind of meeting you're in. Because many of them, they talk about everything except alcoholism and recovery therefrom. We call those group depression meetings. You go in there feeling pretty good. Hell, by the time the meeting's halfway over, you're ready to blow your brains out. There's no sense in living at all. Thank God our fellowship today is slowly turning it back around and slowly starting to talk about what's in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. Because you see what happened to us when we begin to do things in AA other than what's in the big book. We went from a life-changing program to simply a non-drinking program. And we begin to measure success by how long have you been sober, rather than by the quality of that sobriety. And I see people in AA today, some's been sober several years, but they're always griping and bitching and raising hell. And some of them feel so bad you'd like to buy them a drink. You know they'd feel better. I also see people in AA today who've worked the program out of the big book Alcoholics Anonymous, and they're joyous and they're happy and they're free. And they're always laughing and cutting up and having a good time. So what we're going to talk about this weekend is not the program in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. We're going to talk about the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And thank God the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous has never been changed. I think that's the greatest miracle in the world today, that this book was printed in 1939. It's undergone 4 editions, and the program in the book has never been changed. We alcoholics love to change things. Anybody that's ever read the book's rewritten it in their mind 2 or 3 times, but collectively we've never found it necessary to change the program in the book. I wonder why. Anybody care to venture?
It works.
It works, doesn't it? Works just as good today as it did in 1939 for those who wish to use the program in the book. And that's what we'll be talking about, Joe.
Yeah. I remember years ago I called my sponsor Franklin Williams. He's dead now, bless his heart. But I said, Franklin, my program's not working too well. He said, well, tell me what's going on in your program. I said, well, I'm mad at my wife, and I'm mad at the people I work with, and I'm pretty mad at some of the people in the group. And he said, well, Joe, your program's working just the way it's supposed to work. He said, have you ever tried working the program? Yeah. There's a lot of difference between my program and the program. And today in AA, there's a lot of difference between the program in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program that's in the book called Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill saw that happening way back. In 1958, he printed a little flyer, a little pamphlet, and these are available from the central office in New York for free if anybody wants them. And I think everybody in Alcoholics Anonymous ought to read one of this. And it's called Problems Other Than Alcohol, written by Bill Wilson. I didn't write it, neither did Charlie. You want to get that straight. But on page 3 of this little pamphlet, right here at the top, it tells us that the main purpose of AA tells us exactly what it is, and the sole purpose. It said sobriety, freedom from alcohol, through the teaching and practice of the 12 steps is the sole purpose of an AA group. It's not one of the purposes. It is the only reason in the world to have an AA group is to through practice and teaching of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we asked tonight, is your group practicing and teaching the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous in some manner? And if it isn't, we would like for you to go back and ask them if they could study this book as a group and to study these steps as a group, because that's the sole purpose of an AA group. Now that's all the practice, all the preaching we're going to do here tonight. Oh, don't believe that. We're not going to. But let's look at the success they were having in the early days when the people in the fellowship was practicing the principles in the book. Let's see what kind of success they were having. And that's on Roman numeral page 20. And it says, while the internal difficulties of our adolescent period were being ironed out.
It starts at the bottom of Roman numeral 20.
Public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For this there were 2 principal reasons: the large number of recoveries and reunited homes. Now, these made their impressions everywhere. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses, and among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. Other thousands came to a few AA meetings and decided that they didn't want the program, but great numbers of these, about 2 out of 3, began to return as time passed.
It started on page 19, Roman numeral 19, and then into page 20.
Yeah. So it looks to me like, if my math is correct, that 75% of those people who came and really tried ultimately stayed sober.